Hey everybody, and welcome to your regularly scheduled multi-tenancy working group for Kubernetes. Today we're going to talk about hostile multi-tenancy, which Adrian will briefly define for us.
Sure. So I think it was it a Microsoft blog post that we saw that term on?
Yeah.
Do we have any folks from Microsoft on this call? I don't think we do.
Yes.
If you
Hello,
do,
my name's Tommy Faugu.
Oh, hi there. Hi, Tommy. Were you involved in any way in the chat about, or the blog post, I think it was, about hostile multi-tenancy?
No, I'm not. However, I am very interested in your definition of it because I want to see where it aligns with the Microsoft one. And to be honest, I'm kind of curious as to this as well, this whole idea.
Okay. So Adrian, you just reminded me, I had completely forgotten about that. So where this came from was someone at Microsoft who's very senior was tweeting and blog posting about hostile multi-tenancy versus what he was calling enterprise multi-tenancy. And I just thought that that was a really odd way to describe it because what we talk about in this working group, the language that we've sort of coalesced around historically has been soft versus hard multi-tenancy. And so the idea is that soft multi-tenancy is where you can sort of trust the other users. So this really aligns with what the idea of enterprise multi-tenancy was in what we were reading, because the idea is I'm an enterprise, I'm internal IT, I'm providing Kubernetes as a service for my developers to leverage. And now I can kind of trust people not to abuse the system or DDoS each other or whatever because they'll get fired, right? And I just thought that that was a really odd phrasing to say enterprise. And then what he was calling hostile multi-tenancy was the idea of maybe I'm providing Kubernetes as a service on the internet. And so maybe I have a free trial and people can come in and I might have all sorts of people. And so I have to be prepared for this hostile mindset. And I just thought that that was really strange sort of delineation of the two ideas because if you talk to anybody in tech, malicious actors internally, if you're at a significant scale or if money's involved, like Bitcoin, like you got hostile all over the place, right? Like I've talked to some Bitcoin tech companies like years ago, and they were saying they can't even trust their own physical security team because people are just infiltrating like so aggressively, like in every possible way to try to get access to Bitcoin that they see themselves as a security company first and Bitcoin sort of a side project. So I thought that was kind of weird. And then the other piece is you can accidentally DDoS your coworkers and it still hurts just as much as if you intended to. And so not having like those lower level controls and like separation and like trying to kind of control the firestorm when you have like more than say two people working in any environment or even just two, like that was like a little odd. So I think I went on this rant on Slack and then Adrian was like, we should talk about this at multi-tenancy and see why Tasha has so many feelings. So those are my feelings. I will now relinquish the microphone.
Yeah, and Tommy sent out a link, which I believe is to, I'm not sure if this is the exact one we saw, but it certainly has that term of hostile multi-tenancy in there. And I agree that that's roughly the way that that Tasha described it. And yeah, I think I would agree. It's like, I mean, I have my own problems with soft and hard, but as long as we understand that they're on a spectrum, like it's not one-dimensional, it's at least 1.5 dimensional, but it's like, as long as we understand that it's on a spectrum, I think that it becomes a lot more palatable, at least for me, to talk about the degrees to which you trust the other people on your cluster. And yeah, so it's not just external actors, it could be internal threats as well. It could be accidental or malicious, and like simple scale can drive a lot of that as well. So but yeah, like when I think about the types of multi-tenancy that are like completely distinct, I think of things like multi-team tenancy, where everybody who's using the cluster is a team that are working at the same company. They at least can get fired, and so you have some leverage over them, at least in theory. And then the other one is what I would call like SaaS multi-tenancy, where you're running on one cluster many different copies of exactly the same thing. You're running a lot of databases, or you're running a lot of like WordPress sites or something like that. And those, and like the users of those, they don't have access to the Kubernetes API. So that's one whole like attack surface that you can basically just shut down. But you can assume that they are mutually hostile towards each other, like actively hostile, perhaps to a greater extent than you would for different teams in a small, let's say like WordPress hosting business. And so in that case, you need a lot, you might not need like control plane protections like RBAC or network policy, well, maybe network policies, but you don't need things like RBAC or quota as much, but you certainly need things like, I think the Microsoft blog post says you need a hypervisor is the only acceptable level of security. I don't know how that fits in, if they would consider like gvisor or kata containers to be hypervisors. I don't know where that would fit. But you certainly need something at the data plane, because otherwise any vulnerability somebody can exploit and break out.
Yeah, the one that threw out the hypervisors, and the problem with gvisor, right, is it's a virtualized kernel, but you're not guaranteed like CPU level isolation. And
Definitely
so
not.
and so that's kind of where that came from, is like, if you care about the hardware level, CPUs right now, they literally only have provisions for hypervisors to give you that isolation. And so that's kind of where that comes in. But that being said, both Intel and AMD are working on container-based isolation at the CPU and memory level. So that's something.
That'll be cool. When that arrives.
Right. Yeah. When is a big and people actually start using it, right?
Yeah, for sure. Tommy, did you want to weigh in on any of that? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. So disclaimer, I am not part of the Microsoft product group. Instead, I am from I'm a cloud solution architect. And so I work with different companies that are migrating their applications over. And I was very interested in what you had to say about the SaaS multi-tenancy, because that's the realm that I typically live in. And so I'll have to admit that even within, I was curious as to like what Microsoft was defining as the hostile multi-tenancy, because I was curious if they came up with that idea, or if this was something from a Kubernetes standard, or the SIG. So that's why I'm joining.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it was just someone being super like random and off the cuff. And I think the only reason we remember it is that I had such a strong reaction to it. But
people having strong reactions to something Microsoft says, that never happens.
Yeah, no, I just thought it was such strange positioning of enterprise versus hostile, because it seems to me that as an enterprise, you need a lot of the controls, but because of the way you're phrasing it, you're like, well, you don't need this hostile thing. You need enterprise multi-tenancy. And I was kind of like, well, not really sure about that. But yeah, I don't think, I have a feeling it was sort of like a random post. Like I would never presume that this is like Microsoft's governing strategy as with regard to like how to actually achieve secure cloud. But Adrian, when I put this as our topic, I thought this was like a leftover from our panel last week. I didn't realize it was related to this.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges, I think, though, with this notion of any form of multi-tenancy being friendly or being something where you can relax security constraints is a problem, right? Because I think, like we talked about even last week, independent of whether it's a single tenant in a cluster or multiple tenants, most of the security concerns you would have related to pod security, role bindings, access controls, etc., still apply and still need to be configured correctly, right? Because even if it's a single tenant on a cluster, maybe there's some shared services which are managed centrally. You don't want the tenant to be able to accidentally take those down. So you're still going to use namespaces. It's just perhaps to a lesser degree. So there's no such thing as friendly multi-tenancy or hostile, right? It's just
right. But and I mean, I think Kubernetes in general has made it clear that hard multi-tenancy is guaranteed to be impossible right now in Kubernetes. Like the only form of multi-tenancy you can have in Kubernetes, technically, depending on your, I guess, the attack vectors you're worried about, but it's like soft multi-tenancy is really all that is available from a single cluster perspective, right? So you want to lock it down as much as you can regardless, because it's like you've got one cluster, right? One container breakout, you're done. Like one thing, and it could be, right? Like the one thing I think about is Mesos back in the day. If anyone had the gall to use that back, I was a huge
pour one out, yeah.
Right. No, so they had a bug, right, where they at the control plane level, they were using default ports and they weren't properly securing it. And so it was just like that. Bitcoin miners were just literally scraping the internet looking for open ports, and they were injecting Bitcoin containers into Mesos clusters in production. It happened to a lot of people. And that sort of thing is possible. And so you need to treat a Kubernetes cluster like, even if you only have one tenant, it's a single tenant, multi-tenant cluster, right, instead of, open. And I'm not saying that we totally got bit by that Bitcoin thing at all.
And one thing I was curious about is this SIG multi-tenancy. From what I could gather, it seemed to focus more on this multiple user multi-tenancy rather than the SaaS multi-tenancy. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, what I realize sometimes is when we start having these conversations, we did a pretty big breakdown of different use cases of multi-tenancy that I can pull up that we can kind of go through. What I would say is so we have kind of different people trying to solve different problems who are all part of this group. So I think, Adrian, the set of problems that you're trying to solve might align the most with kind of what Tommy's thinking about, because you're basically running like the GKE service, right? And so like that's more like SaaS where people are coming. Is that what you're thinking, Tommy? Is it like PaaS, or are you thinking like I'm a SaaS provider who happens to use Kubernetes to deploy containers?
In the scenario that I see is, hey, look, we've got a Helm chart and we want to deploy a new release of this for each and every customer that we have.
Oh, I see. So every customer.
It's like, hey, look, new namespace, new customer, and new Helm chart or new Helm release.
Kind of like the OpenShift approach.
Like with projects, you mean?
Well, projects are just like a namespace, right?
Sure. We'll say that. Like it's a namespace plus something, plus another value that they might add to it.
But this is the case where like the tenant you're deploying that Helm chart for, they're never going to call like kubectl get namespace or anything like that.
Exactly. It's right. All abstracted away from them as a SaaS solution,
right?
That they're paying for with the license.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like in those scenarios though, right? You still have to have a lot of the forms of the cluster level multi-tenancy safeguards, because especially since if you're running an application level, like SQL injection still plagues the industry, right? So anything like that where you can potentially have access, breaking out of the container or breaking out of the application to get access to the container, if they have open access to do whatever, right? Like if the service account can list all namespaces or whatever, then eventually with enough effort that they could break through. And so you're really at that level only as safe as the application you're running in that container. And that's why scratch containers are pretty awesome, right?
Right.
Yeah, you need something to defend the data plane, right? And yeah, maybe you don't need as much control plane controls. Like for example, like nobody, if you assume that they can't get to the control plane, like the end users, you don't need to worry about like them starting new pods. So you don't have to worry about quotas. Like you can just assume that I assume that your customers will be building some kind of automation that deploy the Helm chart for them, because they're not doing it by hand every time a new customer onboards. So you'll have some kind of automation and you can trust that automation. And so it's just then you're worried about like yeah, you're worried about people breaking out of the containers and container
Right.
escape.
Exactly.
Well, but that could also lead to access to the control plane, right? Because if you can get out of the container, you can access secrets in the namespace, or let's say you get to any host resources, that gets you to other if you happen to figure out where the control plane nodes are running, you can even get to etcd from that, right? So to me, and I know Adrian, we had this discussion also, and perhaps we can segue also into the blog post and resolve some of the comments on that.
Oh, right. Yes.
Yeah, so to me, don't I don't really, I feel both in both cases, whether even if the end consumer is using the application as a SaaS, the tenancy models are still applicable and still seem just as important, because if you don't have the right controls underneath, any exploit in the or any vulnerability in the container which is exploited could lead to bigger challenges and issues like what we're describing. The other kind of comment on that is, even if the end consumer is using the application as a SaaS, typically what we've seen is there are customer success teams and other teams assigned to different customers, and they may need access to just those namespaces to manage that customer, right? So ultimately, you still need to figure out if you're doing clusters as a service or namespaces as a service. Each kind of model has to be secured correctly.
If I remember, there was this great talk, I think at KubeCon North America 2019 or so, called like, "What if your attacker knows parkour?" And it's like, what kind of mischief can you get up to if you can escape the container on the node?
Was that the keynote from gosh, I can't remember their name.
Ian?
But I think I know which one you're talking about anyway.
Yeah, it wasn't Ian's talk, although Ian's
No, it
talk's
wasn't
well.
Ian. It was Rice is the last name, and I can't remember
Liz?
from Aqua or whatever, Aqua Security.
Yeah,
I
Liz
think it's
Rice.
Liz
Yeah, that's
Rice.
right. Was it her keynote?
Can't remember if it was hers or not, but
Anyway,
I don't know.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
I mean, it's got the word parkour in it. It's pretty easy to search on YouTube. But it was a great talk. I can't remember, like, if you can escape if you can escape your container, then yeah, what do you have access to? Do you have access to like any secret and any service account that's ever been used on that node, or do you only have the ones from your container? Because if it's the latter, then you can just like avoid giving, like, you do have to care a little bit about RBAC, but
So that all comes down to how you've actually written your container, right? That's the problem, right? Is like a container is just a C group. And if your container is, UID 1 as root, and you break out of that container, that UID translates over, right, to that node. So then you suddenly are user 1 or you 0, whatever, like your root on the node, and then you have all the root things. So that's the problem with container breakout. But even if you you break out of the application into the container, you have a service account mounted, right? And so that service account, whatever it can do and talk to the cluster, that's your access. So you can, if you give too much permissions on your specific containers from a service account level, because like, oh yeah, let's let this container list all the namespaces, because who knows what they need, right? Suddenly, they have everything. So, and the main thing, right, from the container level is it's what tools they have, right? So if you just have the binary running and they break out of that application into the binary, it's pretty impossible to do a container breakout, right? From that, and unless you're doing some pretty crazy things in the application. So if you don't have things like Bash and all the Linux tools, if you're not using Alpine, it makes it a lot more difficult to break out. So limiting what you put in your containers is super important. It also sucks when you have to debug, but that's what sidecars are for.
True. Yeah, but if you are able to break out of the container, even if that particular container is not running with full privileges, again, if you have access to like things like host mounts, etc., it's also possible to run other containers with higher privileges if that namespace allows that, right? Because once you're there,
right. Yeah. Well, so yeah, I mean, if you break out a container though, I mean, the host mounts and stuff kind of facilitate that, but like a container breakout means you kind of, you break out of that.
right, you're
Effectively, it's just a directory on the node, right? Like
Yeah.
you've broken out of it and you've gotten access to
so
elsewhere.
you can run like etcd and other things if you can find them, right? So yeah,
Right.
there's all sorts of. So there's some good videos out there. I was watching one where they showed exactly that through a node exploit. They got to the container, they looked around, saw which, where the control plane nodes were running, launched a new container running on the control plane, and then got access to etcd.
Mm-hmm. And then, well, yeah, and then like, that's why it's also important to like enforce at a cluster level. Like you always have to pull new containers, caching them to the node sounds convenient, but if you have to force some sort of authorization to pull any container, then you can limit it from that level to prevent, like, oh yeah, let them take our debugging container with all the things at any time. You want to limit that authorization.
Did those exploits that you were talking about, did those rely on the container running as root?
It depends, right? You can still technically like, and I'm not a security expert, clearly, right? Like I'm, but like you can still break out of container through like CVEs that have existed. Like we've totally seen them in Kubernetes. But if you broke out, you're still only have the levels of that user you are. That's why it's like if you just give a UID and a GID that doesn't exist on that node, or like a high one, that's why a lot of people just do something in the thousands, because it's unlikely to have users into that level. Then you basically you have no permissions to do anything, right? Like and so then even if you did break out, you have some sort of kind of prevention there.
Right.
And you might have read access some places and you can kind of glean some info, but it's not as much. But like if you do the default and everyone uses, root as the container, and then they do find a way to break out, then it's kind of game over.
And that's why pod security policies, or whatever the new things are called, pod security levels. What's the new one?
Pod
pod security replacement is all like, yeah. Well, yeah, and that's the main problem with the original pod security policies, right? Is they're cluster level, and so anyone deploying a container can use your least restrictive PSP. So if you suddenly got the capability to do what Jim was saying, is deploy a new container and you had a pod security policy that said, oh yeah, we let this one container have privilege mode. Well, I can just request that PSP in my, when I deploy my new container, and suddenly I can be privileged.
Don't you as a user need permission to isn't there a use verb on the PSP?
Yeah, but it's cluster wide, right? So
cluster wide. But like when you break out of your cluster, you are operating as some identity. If that identity does not have permission to use a certain pod security policy, you shouldn't be able to create a pod with it, right?
But I don't think you can do a per object PSP usage though, can you? I'm pretty sure it's just at the can you leverage PSPs, right? Like it's at the resource level, not at the object level.
Oh, okay.
I mean, that was my understanding.
It's been a while since I looked at pod security policies. So.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of a couple of years ago stopped KubeCon 2019 when they said we're getting rid of it. We're like, all right, so are we then?
I thought the big problem with them is that they're either on or off at a cluster level, and so you can't like incrementally enable them. So if you haven't set up your entire cluster, you can't like gradually turn it on. You turn them on and like every pod on your system will suddenly stop running.
Yeah, that's also an issue with network policies as well. As soon as you put one network policy in place, suddenly the whole cluster is like, well, now I need a network policy.
Yeah, that was one of the challenges. The other challenges was this sort of, somewhat of a conflict of interest, right? Where you can assign PSPs based on roles, but ultimately, it's like a deployment or some other pod controller running that pod, not a role, right? So you get into situations like that with trying to manage PSPs correctly across different applications or workloads. So I think the new proposal now is just doing this based on, like we discussed briefly last time, like on namespaces, just to make that boundary clear that the only strong isolation boundary is a namespace, and anything within that namespace, if you can run a pod in that namespace, you can get the same privileges as the highest privilege pod in that namespace.
Right, which should be better. Yeah, I'm just looking, right, I'm just looking at the docs. You can, the way it works is that for a pod to use a pod security policy, its service account has to be authorized through RBAC, and you can name individual PSPs. So it's not like open season. But if that's, it does, I think to Jim's point, it's hard to use. And so it's probably quite likely that in real life, a lot of service accounts would be allowed to use a lot of policies just to
So
make
yeah,
that
I guess
easy.
I'm not seeing that in the docs. If you could send me that, because I'm just seeing the API groups where it's, use pods, use it at the resource level, not at an actual object level.
Oh, resource name in the, yeah, you say basically resource name, so you can actually name individual policies that you
Oh,
want to.
interesting. Okay, well, that's good to know.
But it's not.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so I take it back. That's so. Now that I'm jogging my memory, I'm thinking back to the days of Tiller where you basically had to have root to do anything, use Helm, and that's why that loophole existed for us.
Right.
Okay, never mind. So I'm just wrong as usual. Thanks, appreciate it.
Tiller was a thing.
Yeah, those I thought I had fully forgot about it, but
I mean, Helm 3 like just came out, so the scar tissue is like fairly new.
Yeah. It's been out for a while. I mean, it's a lot easier to work with, but it kind of seems like customize is almost like they're kind of removing it from Control, aren't they?
Oh, are they? I didn't know that.
Are there? It's like it's taking. It seems like it's not as pushed as it once was. I thought I read something. I don't know.
I didn't know
Yeah, the
that.
version in kubectl is fairly old. It hasn't been updated for a while, so I think anybody who uses customized needs to download it separately for the newer versions.
Yeah.
That's what I do.
Hey, so do we want to go through the remaining comments on the blog and get that resolved? Because I think it'd be good if most of us can, get the, I guess, add the approval on the PR, and then I'll circle back with the blog reviewers.
Yeah, all of my questions or comments were optional. Like I'm happy for it to go at any point. So I just left some thoughts, and I'm really sorry that I left it so late.
No, that's all right. I think this is good feedback. And I did, so I reorganized. And so let me, Tasha, I'm not sure if you have the link and want to share, or if you want, I can share, but I might need permissions.
Yeah, let me promote you.
All right, I see. Okay, so yeah, this is the preview. I'll add that to the chat too, so everybody can take a look. Oops, I can't find my chat window now. Hang on, oh, there it is. And yeah, on the PR, so I think, yeah, so we were just talking about teams versus tenants, right? And so that's one thing we should decide on the terminology. And I'm fine with just, if we want to remove multi from the title, we can kind of just call it two common tenancy models. I think that was one of your suggestions to Adrian.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I'm going to back down on calling it multi-team tenancy. So yeah, let's just take that off the table. I did think of maybe calling it just tenancy models as opposed to multi-tenancy models, just because I think most people consider lots of different clusters to not really be multi-tenancy. I've heard a couple of names used for that. I've heard like multi-single tenant, or just like cluster per team or something like that, or cluster per something. But yeah, I don't know. It was just a thought that.
I mean, I know a lot of people too, like the computer science like definition of multi-tenancy is only hard multi-tenancy, and anything else is not real multi-tenancy. So yeah, like it does put some people off just by using that when you're not talking about, you know, the strict definition. But then tenancy, that just is whatever. So we got our own term now, right?
So how about multi-team tenancy? We can
Or just tenancy, just say, yeah, tenancy, you know, like
tenancy, collecting rent 101.
yeah,
we could go with that. So just get rid of multi from the title and maybe a few other places.
Yeah.
Tenants, or we could just say call this like usage models or tenant usage
Yeah,
models.
tenancy usage models, exactly.
Okay. All right. That sounds good. And let's see.
The only other really big one is, do virtual clusters deserve their own?
All right.
I think everything else was very small, and I don't know
Yeah.
if we discuss it, but.
Yeah, so I'm fine with that too. Like if we want to pull out virtual clusters from clusters as a service. So right now it just says, you know, namespaces as a service and clusters. And the thinking there was the end user may not care whether the cluster is virtual or not, but of course there are some differences. So yeah, any other thoughts on that? Should we stay with 2, or what would we call? So if we split this, it would be virtual clusters as a service, and what's the sort of real clusters or physical clusters? Physical doesn't sound right.
I think if you just clusters as a service, I mean, Faye can chime in, or Chris here if they want to, but like clusters and virtual clusters seems like a reasonable distinction, because like to me, the big difference between those two is that with clusters as a service, or clusters like multi-cluster, no two pods can ever sit on the same node. Whereas with VCs, they can. That's kind of the point. And so that's like, you get an additional level of security separation and noisy neighbor separation. So it's like, it is a sort of compromise between the two.
Right.
So I don't think it needs to be like, drastically rewritten. It's just like, right about that paragraph there. You can just say like virtual clusters. Just say like, this is an intermediate. It's got some of the advantages and disadvantages of both. Faye, I take it you would not object to us calling out VCs with more prominence?
So I'm okay with current writing, but I see your point. So you want to make a distinguish with, you know, dedicated cluster versus dedicated control plane, right? So there is a slight difference there, right? So dedicated cluster means, you know, as you said, tenant pods cannot run in the same node.
Yeah, so one way of titling it, and I think I had that at one point, is you could say something, and Tasha, you had used these terms too, like shared cluster, dedicated cluster, and then virtual clusters, right? So those could be 3, but then it moves away from the as a service. So I guess that's, which is fine. We could go with something like that.
Yeah, I think maybe in that sense, maybe cluster as a service to refer to the conventional multi-cluster solution, or if you can say just control plane as a service. I think maybe more clear compared with virtual cluster from the reader's perspective. Please, do you have any comments?
That was exactly what I was going to say. I basically refer to VC as control plane as a service versus cluster as a service, just because that's really what you're getting out of it. You shared cluster at the outset, but really it's just a dedicated control plane that you get to muck with.
Yeah, I feel that may make the term more clear. So just in the control plane as a service, we have a project for virtual cluster. So virtual cluster will be wait, yeah, if you call it out directly.
Okay, so so call it namespace as a service, clusters as a service, and control plane as a service. Would that?
Yeah. So I would suggest is that if you want to separate them.
Sounds good to me. Yeah, other than that, I think that the blog looks great. So thanks everybody who took the lead on that.
And then I think, Jim, we still need a third approval from,
Right.
like, who was it the blog team needs to, do we get a technical and a editor and a grammatical editor? Is that who we get?
I believe so. I think Tim linked the process, but I don't know who is.
Yeah, I mean, they linked the process and I said, you need, an
Right.
LGMT from like these 3 different groups, but it's not clear to me
Who's
who
who?
belongs to
Right.
those groups and what ones we've got. So
Right.
I was hoping you knew that.
I do not. I can ask again, but yeah, they've been fairly active with all of the 1.21 posts which need to go out. So, and I think we can work with them in terms of the timeline. So we want this published before KubeCon EU, right? And I believe that's early May.
Yeah, it's coming up quick. I think it's like
Right.
exactly a month away.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, obviously, like the first thing, once we're all settled on any changes we want to make, I can go back to them and see, yeah, check with them and others because they'll have to go through it again, and because of some of the changes, and once they sign off, they'll figure out who's the last reviewer. Yeah, so this is the process he had linked. And it says copy editor, technical editor, and a blog community manager.
Right. And so we have 2, and it's just not clear to me who those 2 belong to.
Right. Yes, so we have Tim, this gentleman, Tang, and then Karen Bradshaw, who have signed off. Okay. Yeah, so I'll check with them and see what's going on and just mention that we want, if we can get this published before KubeCon EU, that would be awesome. And so I don't know what the exact release timeline is, but yeah, once, based on when that goes out, we could time it before or after.
Cool. We
All
don't
right.
need help with anything.
Cool. Thanks.
Sounds good.
So Tasha, I gotta ask, are you sitting like 10 feet in the air? Because like from the view, it looks like you're like touching the ceiling.
Or it's a very small room. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm in a loft. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yep. COVID loft.
Nice. You're just like,
I
I was
can't
gonna
stand
talk
up.
about you. Yeah.
Not a standing desk.
Yeah. I was like, well, maybe it's a standing desk in a basement somewhere or whatever.
Yeah, no, we're about 16 feet off the floor. Yeah. But yeah. Cool. Well, my mouse briefly worked, so I'm gonna stop the recording while I still can.